Ukraine has a plan to defeat the Russians and to revive its economy. And to do this, Zelensky will also help Europe and the entire West. For years, the conflict has been assessed based on territory lost or gained, the number of soldiers, and the available weaponry. And these things matter, but they're no longer enough, especially for Ukraine. Kyiv, in fact, doesn't have the same population as Russia, and with fewer people, it can't withstand prolonged losses over time. That's why today Kyiv's priority isn't just to increase the number of soldiers, but to replace them with robots. And this concerns drones, but increasingly also ground robots. Many of you watch my videos but aren't subscribed, so please subscribe if you want the project to grow. Thank you very much. Ukraine can't afford a war of attrition the way Moscow can. In fact, Russia, having more inhabitants, can send more men to the front and accept more losses. Ukraine can't. Partly because its population is about a third of Russia's, and partly because for Kyiv, protecting human life is more important. That's why Zelensky has to compensate with technology and organization, and he's doing it with drones and robots deployed instead of men. And clearly Russia too, although a bit late, has invested in drones. So much so that in 2025, the losses suffered by the two armies because of drones went from less than 10% in 2022 to 80% last year. But how did we get to this point? At the beginning, this war was more traditional, with tanks and infantry at the center of operations, while drones were used to observe the enemy and provide information to the units that then carried out the attacks. Over time, however, drones evolved and became cheaper, easier to produce, but most importantly, they started hitting targets. So their presence has made any movement on the battlefield increasingly risky, since it can now be easily spotted and attacked within minutes by the same drone. And this applies to both the Russians and the Ukrainians. That's why they've moved on to the next step. And alongside aerial drones, ground robots have arrived, unmanned vehicles that replace soldiers in the most dangerous tasks. Just think, in November 2024, Reuters was already reporting that there were more than 160 companies in Ukraine involved in building unmanned ground vehicles used to deliver supplies, evacuate the wounded, or even transport remotely operated machine guns. Meanwhile, in February 2026, Ukrainian government sources stated that these robots had already carried out over 7,000 missions in January alone. And now there is already talk of over 21,500 ground robot missions in the first quarter of 2026, with more than 9,000 missions in March alone and 167 units involved compared to just 67 in November 2021. And a few days later, Zelensky also spoke about an enemy position captured exclusively by unmanned vehicles and therefore without any Ukrainian losses. In short, Russia mainly uses manpower while Ukraine is trying to rely more and more on technology. But be careful, because this doesn't mean that Russia isn't innovating at all. In fact, already in 2024, both Ukraine and Russia were moving towards producing about 1.5 million drones in just 1 year. And at the same time, it's also wrong to think that Ukraine can fight without soldiers, because technology can't completely replace them, at least for now. So, why does Ukraine seem to be working better? Because even with technology, Russia still mainly focuses on quantity. They send more men to the front and can withstand losses for a longer time. And it doesn't matter much if Russia's population keeps shrinking with each passing day. Ukraine, by contrast, uses technology to lower risk for soldiers and make operations safer and more effective. In addition, every use of drones and robots leaves behind data and experience. And this is also due to the fact that Kyiv, with a smaller population to draw on than Russia, is forced to use ingenuity to make up for Putin's numbers, since he can send many more men to the front. And this is the point, because a lost soldier is a loss that can never be recovered, while a technological system can be continuously updated and improved. And this means that while the war continues, a part of the Ukrainian system evolves, while a part of the Russian army disappears. Then there's also another important element, which is that the advantage doesn't depend on a single drone or a single technology, but on the whole system based on the speed of innovation and the ability to adapt. And all this, what does it mean on an economic level? War destroys and impoverishes, and this doesn't change. But often it also accelerates processes that in normal times would take years and years. And this is exactly what's happening in Ukraine, because while the country is fighting, it's also building productive capacities that didn't exist before or were much weaker. And the numbers help to understand the speed of the change. In 2024, Reuters explained that the vast majority of the more than 800 Ukrainian defense companies were founded after the 2022 invasion. And in 2026, we're talking about over 1,000 companies, mostly private and founded during the war itself. Just think, Zelensky mentioned about 450 drone manufacturers in the country. And already in 2024, the Minister of Digital Transformation, Mikhail Fedorov, explained that the production and delivery of drones had increased by more than 120 times in 2023. While long-range drones were a category that didn't even exist 2 years earlier. This means that Ukraine is building an industry around this technology. and what is created for military needs is being organized into a real industrial supply chain. And that's how a system is forming in which the army, ministries, startups, and companies work together and adapt quickly. With weapons and systems that are tested in the field and results come immediately. When something works, they work to improve it. When it doesn't work, it is changed or abandoned. And Reuters explained that the pressure of war has reduced development times in the European and Western defense sector from years to just a few months. Today, Ukraine serves as a military technology lab where everything is tested in real conditions, making it easier to see what works and what doesn't. And this is exactly what interests investors, governments, and Western industries, because in the defense market, it's not just about having good technology, but about having it tested in real situations. A system proven in war is more valuable because it shows it works, making it more appealing to buyers, investors, and those looking to build partnerships. That's why everyone is now interested in Ukrainian drones, from European countries, even Saudi Arabia to the United States, no matter what Donald Trump says. And what does all this mean for the future of Kyiv? If this know-how stays within the Ukrainian system, the advantage built today could have effects even after the end of the conflict. Not just militarily, but especially economically and industrially, as this will serve as a concrete foundation for reconstruction and foreign relations. Just think that in February 2026, Zelensky announced the opening of 10 export centers in Europe for Ukrainian weapons. And shortly after, Kyiv even granted the first wartime export licenses to domestic producers, in a sector that, according to the Ukrainian leadership, already had a capacity exceeding $55 billion, and during the same period, the first Ukrainian military factory was launched in Great Britain. This means that Kyiv is trying to turn the results achieved on the battlefield into industrial capacity and stable economic relations. Also because after the war, Ukraine will need capital, investments, and skilled labor, but also integration into Western defense supply chains. And so, if it can offer already tested products, software, technical expertise, and the ability to integrate systems, then it will not present itself only as a country to be supported and helped, but as a partner with something concrete and very useful to offer. And this dynamic can already be seen outside of Europe as well. In fact, Zelensky stated that Ukrainian personnel helped shoot down Shahed drones in several Middle Eastern countries during the conflict with Iran. And in return, Kyiv obtained energy support, fuel, and financial agreements with the goal of turning these collaborations into structured relationships. The British have also described Ukrainian drone technology as among the most advanced. And the point is simple. Ukrainian reconstruction can depend not only on aid, but also on the ability to sell skills and technologies developed during the conflict. And keep in mind, all this also means that Ukraine, if things continue this way, will become a much more influential player in Europe and in the world than it has ever been before. In short, Zelensky's plan doesn't seem to be just to stay afloat, but to build a model through which Ukraine can also become more influential and economically strong in the future, even after his presidency. But be careful. Not everything that glitters is gold, and Ukraine also faces major limitations. Just a second, I decided to create a path designed for freelancers or aspiring freelancers who want to structure their own business, even on social media. I created it together with Valencia Falconi, business strategist and author of the podcast Business in Svolta, and in our project she takes care of everything related to defining ideal clients, building the offer, pricing, finding clients, and so on. While I handle everything related to social media presence, helping you build authority in your field. So, if you want to know more, book the free call from the link in the description and in the first comment. Valencia will review your skills with you and provide an action plan after the call, with no obligation whether you choose to work with us or not. Now, back to Ukraine. What are the limits for Kyiv? First of all, technology helps both to reduce risks and to increase effectiveness, but unfortunately, it doesn't completely replace soldiers. Because the territory still needs to be controlled, the lines have to be defended, and cities require a human presence. So remote systems can support all these activities, but they can't do everything on their own. At the same time, Russia remains a much bigger power, both economically and demographically. And this gives it an ability to sustain the conflict over time that Ukraine does not have, especially if Europe were to loosen its grip, for example due to populist victories in some countries, let's hope not, or because of economic difficulties, as could happen due to the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. A blockade of the Strait of Hormuz could even cause some sanctions on Russian gas to be lifted as early as 2027. Moscow also uses drones, updates systems, and adapts to battlefield conditions. And this means that Ukraine's technological advantage is not guaranteed and is part of an ongoing competition. There's also a major industrial challenge, as scaling these technologies is complex and needs a strong supply chain. And several bottlenecks have already been reported, from the lack of pathways and qualified personnel to limitations in public contracts, and even the lack in Europe of small engines for drones that strike at long range. According to some sources, this is one of the main factors slowing down the Ukrainian program. Of course, the production of these engines has increased fivefold since 2023 and could reach up to 8 times by the end of the year, but demand still remains higher than supply. Finally, technology does not automatically guarantee victory. It can improve performance, reduce losses, and make the conflict more sustainable, but it does not eliminate risks and is not enough on its own to completely change the outcome of the war. And yet, despite all this, Ukraine has understood that it cannot beat Russia in terms of quantity. So it is working to beat it in terms of efficiency, trying to turn the war into a competition of productivity and innovation. And if this strategy holds, as I hope, then Zelensky's crazy plan will no longer be just to resist Russia, but to make Ukraine a new power in the long run. Do you think Ukraine can defeat Russia? Share in the comments and book a free call with Valencia if you're a professional freelancer. Bye!